What if the life you are waiting for is already waiting for the version of you that stops asking for permission? Because the moment you stop living like an ordinary participant in your life, something inside you begins to reorganize reality from within. If you're understanding this, don't just listen, observe yourself right now. Notice where you still act from hesitation. Then, for the next few minutes today, consciously shift into the version of you that moves without asking for permission, even slightly. That's where the change begins. The idea that chosen is a mindset rather than a literal external selection means that nothing outside of you is actually assigning you a role in life. Instead, your experience is shaped by how you define yourself internally and how consistently you hold that definition. When someone identifies as not ready, not enough, or still waiting, they begin to interpret life through that limitation. Opportunities may exist, but they are filtered through hesitation, doubt, and self-doubt, which reduces action and weakens momentum. In contrast, when someone adopts the mindset of being chosen, they are not claiming superiority or special permission from the universe, but rather stepping into a self-concept where they assume alignment with their desire is already in motion. This shift changes behavior subtly but powerfully. A person who sees themselves as chosen stops negotiating with fear as often. They begin to act with more certainty, not because circumstances changed, but because their internal identity did. The brain then starts to reinforce this identity through selective attention, noticing possibilities instead of obstacles. This is not mystical. It is psychological repetition shaping perception. The mind naturally seeks evidence that matches its dominant self-image. Over time, this assumed identity becomes familiar, and what becomes familiar begins to feel true. Once it feels true, action becomes easier, decisions become clearer, and resistance decreases. The chosen state is therefore not about waiting for external validation, but about internally sustaining a version of self that consistently moves as if life is already responding to them. When identity is shaped by assumption rather than circumstances, it means your external world does not define who you are in real time. Instead, the meaning you repeatedly assign to yourself becomes the foundation of your behavior and perception. Circumstances are always temporary and incomplete, but assumption is continuous. So when someone bases their identity on what is currently happening, failure, delay, confusion, they lock themselves into reacting instead of creating. But when they shift into assumption, they begin to operate from an inner decision that is not dependent on proof. Assumption works because the mind does not distinguish sharply between repeated imagined states and lived experience when emotion and attention are involved. If you consistently assume you are becoming, receiving, or aligning with something greater, your mind starts organizing thoughts, interpretations, and actions around that assumption. It begins subtly filtering reality in a way that supports the inner narrative you hold most often. This does not mean ignoring reality. It means not letting reality be the authority over your identity. Instead of saying, "I will believe it when I see it," assumption flips the direction. I will begin to see it because I consistently hold it as true internally. This creates a shift in behavior. You start acting slightly earlier, deciding slightly faster, hesitating slightly less. Over time, these small adjustments accumulate. The identity formed through assumption becomes stronger than the identity formed through circumstance because it is reinforced daily from within. Eventually, what you assume about yourself becomes the lens through which you automatically interpret everything you experience. Inner state determining outer expression means that what you consistently feel and hold within yourself naturally shapes how you behave, speak, and interpret the world around you. Your external life is not randomly disconnected from your internal condition. It is constantly being filtered through it. When the inner state is uncertain, hesitant, or fearful, even neutral situations can feel like obstacles. But when the inner state is calm, certain, and aligned, the same situations are approached differently, with more clarity and direction. This happens because your inner state acts like a lens. It doesn't just influence emotions, it influences perception itself. Two people can face the same opportunity, but their inner state will determine whether they see possibility or limitation. One may see risk and withdraw, while the other sees potential and engages. The difference is not the situation, but the internal condition interpreting it. Expression follows this inner condition naturally. You don't have to consciously force confidence or clarity. When the inner state is stable, your tone of voice, posture, decisions, and timing begin to reflect that stability without effort. This is why trying to change only external behavior without changing inner state often feels inconsistent. It is not aligned at the root. Over time, repeated inner states become habitual, and habits form personality. So if someone repeatedly returns to a state of certainty or grounded expectation, their outward expression begins to match that internal pattern. The external world then responds differently, not because reality itself changed instantly, but because the person interacting with it is no longer operating from the same inner frequency as before. When acting as if, you are not pretending in a superficial sense, but temporarily adopting a mental and emotional position that aligns with the outcome you desire. This works because the subconscious mind learns primarily through repetition, emotional imprinting, and lived internal experience rather than logical argument. When you consistently act from a chosen state, even briefly, you begin to create familiarity with that identity. And familiarity is what the mind eventually accepts as real. At first it may feel artificial because your current self-concept is still dominant. But every time you step into the as-if state, you are introducing a new pattern into your system. Even small actions, thinking differently for a moment, responding with slightly more certainty, imagining outcomes as already unfolding serve as signals to the subconscious that this is a possible way of being. These signals accumulate over time. The key is emotional consistency, not perfection. The mind does not require you to fully believe at the start. It only requires repeated exposure to a stable pattern. As you continue acting from that state, your reactions begin to shift automatically. What once required effort starts becoming natural because the nervous system has adapted to the repeated experience. Eventually, the boundary between acting as if and being begins to blur. This is where identity change happens. You stop consciously trying to behave differently because the new pattern has become the default response. The subconscious no longer treats it as a temporary performance but as a familiar identity, and from that point, your behavior, decisions, and expectations begin to align effortlessly with that internalized state. Emotional certainty does not mean having proof or absolute external confirmation. It means internally settling into a feeling of this is how it is becoming for me without constantly debating it in the mind. Logic often demands evidence before acceptance, but the emotional system works in reverse. It begins to stabilize when a state is repeatedly felt, even in small doses. This is why emotional certainty is more influential than intellectual reasoning when it comes to inner change. When you are emotionally uncertain, your mind keeps scanning for contradiction. Every delay, every setback, every neutral event gets interpreted as evidence that things are not working. This creates inner fragmentation, where desire and doubt exist at the same time, pulling your attention in opposite directions. But when emotional certainty is present, even without external proof, the interpretation of events changes. You begin to see the same circumstances through a calmer, more aligned lens. This does not mean ignoring reality or forcing positivity. It means maintaining a steady inner tone that does not fluctuate wildly based on immediate conditions. That steady tone becomes the reference point for your decisions. Instead of reacting emotionally to every external signal, you respond from a stable internal position. Over time, this consistency reshapes your perception. The mind starts selecting thoughts that match the dominant emotional state, and actions begin to follow that internal alignment. Emotional certainty does not eliminate uncertainty in the outer world immediately, but it reduces its power over you. And when external uncertainty no longer controls your internal state, your behavior becomes more decisive, focused, and naturally aligned with the direction you have chosen. Self-talk is one of the most overlooked forces shaping your identity because it operates silently and continuously in the background of your mind. It is not just random thinking, it is constant instruction. Every statement you repeat internally, whether consciously or unconsciously, acts like a signal that reinforces who you believe you are and what you expect from life. When your self-talk is dominated by doubt, delay, or limitation, your mind begins to organize perception around those themes. You start interpreting situations in ways that confirm hesitation. For example, a neutral delay becomes nothing is working, or a small setback becomes this always happens to me. Over time, this creates a stable internal narrative, and that narrative influences how you behave without you even realizing it. But when self-talk shifts, even slightly, the entire internal direction begins to change. If you begin to consistently speak inwardly from a place of possibility, direction, or calm expectation, your mind starts to adapt to that language. It does not require full belief at first, it only requires repetition. The subconscious begins treating repeated statements as familiar patterns, and familiarity reduces resistance. This is why inner dialogue is essentially programming. It doesn't matter whether the words are dramatic or subtle, what matters is consistency. Repeated inner phrases become emotional habits, and emotional habits shape decisions, timing, and perception. Over time, your self-talk becomes the foundation of your identity, because whatever you continuously tell yourself becomes the lens through which you interpret both yourself and your world. Doubt weakens action not because it stops you completely, but because it fragments your inner direction. When doubt is active, your mind begins to split between I can and I can't at the same time, and that internal conflict drains clarity. Even when you try to move forward, part of your attention is constantly questioning the move, which reduces momentum and makes every step feel heavier than it actually is. Action requires psychological unity. When your inner state is aligned, even imperfectly, decisions feel more direct and execution becomes smoother. But when doubt is present, it introduces hesitation at every stage. Before acting, while acting, and after acting. You don't fully commit to the movement, so the energy behind the action becomes diluted. On the other hand, assumption strengthens momentum because it removes the constant need for verification. When you assume something is already in motion or aligned with you, your mind stops pausing to question every step. You begin to act from a more continuous flow rather than fragmented thought. This creates a sense of inner stability, even if external results have not fully appeared yet. Over time, doubt trains you to stop halfway, while assumption trains you to continue without interruption. This difference is subtle but powerful. One creates hesitation loops, and the other creates forward movement loops. As these patterns repeat, they become your default way of responding to life. Eventually, your ability to act decisively depends less on external certainty and more on which internal habit, doubt or assumption you have strengthened most consistently. Consistency of inner identity means repeatedly returning to the same self-concept and emotional tone until it becomes your default way of being. It is not about intense moments of motivation or sudden breakthroughs, but about steady reinforcement of who you decide to be internally. Every time you think, feel, or respond in alignment with a chosen identity, you are strengthening that pattern within your subconscious. Most people experience frequent identity shifts throughout the day. They feel confident in one moment, doubtful in the next, hopeful in the morning, and discouraged at night. This inconsistency prevents any stable internal foundation from forming. Without stability, the mind keeps resetting, and no long-term change takes root. But when inner identity becomes consistent, something important happens. Your reactions begin to stabilize. You stop oscillating between opposing emotional states as often. Your decisions become less dependent on external conditions because your internal reference point is no longer changing every few hours. This creates psychological continuity. The subconscious mind learns through repetition, not occasional intensity. So when a particular identity, calm, focused, certain, aligned, is reinforced again and again, even in small moments, it gradually becomes the dominant pattern. Once that happens, your perception of reality changes automatically because you are no longer interpreting life from a fragmented self but from a unified internal state. Over time, this consistency shapes not only how you feel but how you act, what you notice, and what you allow yourself to expect. Identity stops being something you switch into and becomes something you naturally express without effort, because it has been reinforced often enough to feel like the only version of you that is familiar and real. The conclusion of everything you've explored is simple. Nothing outside of you changes first. Your inner identity leads and everything else follows. What you consistently assume, feel, and repeat internally becomes the structure through which you experience life, not because the outer world instantly bends, but because your perception, behavior, and decisions begin to align with what you have accepted within. You were never meant to wait for proof before stepping into a new version of yourself. Waiting keeps you locked in reaction, while assumption places you in creation. When you consistently act from a chosen identity, speak from it, and return to its feeling even briefly, You are no longer hoping for change, you are embodying the direction of it. Doubt weakens this process by splitting your attention, while assumption strengthens it by unifying your inner state. Emotional certainty, self-talk, repetition, and consistency are not separate tools. They are all ways of stabilizing a single internal reality until it becomes natural. And once something becomes natural internally, it stops feeling like effort. You no longer try to be it, you simply express it. Your actions become clearer, your responses become steadier, and your perception shifts without force. In the end, transformation is not about becoming chosen by something outside you. It is about choosing a state within yourself so consistently that it becomes your identity. And once identity stabilizes, life has no choice but to reflect the version of you that is now being lived from within.